Hello everyone, this is Mr. O'Neill and we're going to talk about characters in fiction. Characters are defined as a person, thing, or animal, anyone that does anything or responsible thoughts or actions in a story. Whether it's an animal, whether it's an inanimate object, if they do something and think, then they are a character. Now authors tend to describe these characters using something called characterization. And there are two main types of characterization. And when I talk about characterization, I'm talking about simply the way the author describes that character. One type of characterization is direct characterization, and that is when the author tells the reader what character traits a character has. Right? And I have two examples for you. One is Jack is such an outgoing person. What do you know about Jack? You know he's outgoing. How do you know that? Because the author tells you he's outgoing. Here's another example. I have never seen a more depressed person than Sally. Well, what do you know about Sally? You know that she's super depressed. And how do you know that? The author tells you that she's super depressed. Another type of characterization is indirect characterization. And this is when the author shows you through their actions, through their words, through the way they appear, the author shows you their character traits. And there are a number of ways that they do this. Right? You can show character traits through a character's appearance. The fact that Sue always comes to school with torn clothes and messy hair tells you something about her. Through the character's actions, that also tells you something about a character. Ivan is always throwing people out of his way. I've never seen him back down from anybody ever. That tells you something about Ivan. What kind of person is Ivan? What character traits does he possess? When the author reveals a character's thoughts, it also tells you something about that character. I will make it onto the varsity team, thought Jackson. Jackson really wants to be on the varsity team. What does that tell you about him? The fact that he will, or he thinks that he will make it onto the varsity team. What does that tell you about Jackson? When the author lets the character speak, that can also reveal to you something about that character. There ain't no way you peoples is coming onto my bridge, said little Tom. That phrase, that speech, that little bit of dialogue tells you something about little Tom. And last of all, how other peoples react to the character. Barney didn't seem to notice that whenever he walked up to anyone, they cringed and tried to back away from him. So there's a number of things that you can see in this small passage. The fact that people are cringing away from him tells you something about Barney. Also, the fact that Barney doesn't notice that these people are cringing away from him tells you something about Barney. So the way people react also tells you something about the character. So those are the two ways that an author can characterize their character. And then we're going to talk about character types. Character types are basic qualities of a character in fiction. And there are four main types. Right? Character will always possess these types. Right? And there are four basic ones. Right? They can be flat or round, and they can be dynamic or static. So they're always going to possess two of these. They can be flat and dynamic, or they can be flat and static. Or they can be round and dynamic, or round and static. So they're going to have two of these qualities, but you can mix and match them in almost any way. The two exceptions being you can't have a character that is both flat and round. You can't have a character that's dynamic and static. So when we talk about flat characters, we're talking about characters that only have one or two qualities. Right? They're not complex, and they can be stock or stereotypes. One example of a flat character would be Jafar from Aladdin. He is evil and he is ambitious, and that's it. Those are the only qualities that he possesses. There is never any sort of internal struggle with him. He never questions what he's doing. He always wants to be evil. He always wants to be ambitious. And he never suffers any sort of internal struggle. Now, round characters, on the other hand, are the opposite. Round characters are complex, they can be inconsistent or unpredictable, and they're hard to summarize, just like real people. And they display internal conflicts. Right? An example of this is Frodo Baggins from Lord of the Rings. Right? He suffers internal struggle. He often doesn't know what the right thing to do is, whether or not he should go on the adventure, whether or not he should stay home, whether or not he should let other people carry the ring, what to do with Gollum. He suffers a lot of internal conflict, and it is hard to summarize in 1 or 2 words. Static characters, on the other hand, are characters that don't change. Regardless of what happens to them in the story, they just don't change. And the reader's knowledge of him or her never grows because they don't change. Right? An example of this is SpongeBob. Right? He's not very smart, he's very innocent, and that's it. He doesn't really change. He's always that person. A dynamic character is someone that does undergo change because of the plot. Right? And that change has to be significant. It can't just be that they were feeling sad this morning and now they're feeling happy. Right? It has to be something big. And when we talk about substantive change, we're also not talking about physical change. If your person's happy and then they die, that does not mean that they're dynamic. It just means that they died. All right? So a dynamic change is a significant change in their personality. Some examples. We have Gru from Despicable Me. He used to be a bad person, and then after he meets the girls and starts to fall in love with them and becomes their stepfather, he becomes a good person. Another example is Anakin Skywalker. Right? He starts off as a young boy that wants to do the right thing, and over the course of events he becomes an evil person. Right? And those are 2 examples of dynamic characters. So let's review what we've covered so far. All right, we have characters, which are simply people, things, or animals in a story that do something or think something. We have characterization, the process that writers use to describe something or someone. We have direct characterization, which is when the author describes something directly, when they simply tell the reader the quality of a person or thing. And we have indirect characterization, which is when they show you what kind of character trait that person has. Usually you have to infer it. We have flat characters, characters that only possess 1 or 2 traits. And we have round characters, characters that are complex and difficult to summarize. Right? They suffer from internal struggles. Right? They have internal conflicts. Static characters are characters that don't change in a story regardless of what happens. And that could be, again, Jafar. He's an example of a static character. He starts as evil, he ends as evil. He's always evil. He doesn't have very many traits, so he's both flat and static. Then we have dynamic characters, characters that go through a substantial personality change. They start off as one thing and end as something else. Alright, so that is characters, characterization, and the different types of characters that we have in stories. Alright, please review this. You need to know this information. Have a good day.